Welcome to Tiski Sour. Thank you for joining us slightly earlier than usual. We'll be back at the same time next week. Last week, after 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, Julian Assange was arrested by British police. The arrest was a result of a changed attitude from a more US-friendly Ecuadorian administration. They withdrew his asylum. He was then arrested by the British police on charges of breaching bail, but more significantly, he now faces extradition to the US for conspiracy to break into government computers. The British left has been fairly united in its opposition to the extradition to America, but divided on the extent to which Assange deserves our solidarity. That's primarily because of his avoiding rape charges in Sweden 7 years ago. On tonight's show, we'll discuss whether Assange will be extradited to the US, whether he should be extradited to Sweden, as well as the legacy and continued impact of the organisation he founded, Wikileaks. I'm joined in the studio by Rebecca Niblock, who is a lawyer at Kingsley Napley and co-authored Extradition Law, a Practitioner's Guide, so is in a perfect position to tell us the state of play when it comes to Assange's extradition, and Eva Blum-Dumontet, who is a privacy campaigner and former staff writer for WikiLeaks Press. But before we talk in the studio, earlier today I spoke to Stefania Maurizi, who is a journalist who's worked closely with WikiLeaks for a decade and is a friend of Assange. We're just going to go to that interview now.
Stefania Maurizi, thank you for joining us on the show. So I wanted to talk specifically about the arrest and why that's happened now. So there's been a fair few UK media about how Assange behaved within the embassy. So there's ideas that he was smearing feces on the wall or that he was abusive towards staff. And I know that you've visited Assange many times in the Ecuadorian embassy, and I wondered what you thought about those claims and why you think this arrest or the ejection by Ecuador from the embassy happened now.
Yes, I visited him many times. You have to realize that in the last 10 years of my work with him, I just met him as a free man once. That was in September 2010. After that meeting, I always met Julian Assange confined somewhere, first at the house arrest, then in the embassy. So in 10 years, I only met him as a free man once. This is shocking if you think about it. It's really shocking. The narrative right now is that he basically went mad and he started abusing the diplomatic people inside the embassy. This is a narrative just trying to dehumanize him, to make him appearing a creepy guy, a guy who is out of control after many years of confinement. This is completely false. He was not out of control. He was always rational. Of course, he was under tremendous stress. I would get mad after 7 months, not after 7 years in the embassy. And I still wondering how his mind kept working in those conditions, because I would have been unable to be so rational as he was, and with his mind working properly as it was. So the narrative right now is that he basically started being abusive and put his underwear everywhere, and had this cat. The cat was one of the most sweet and spoiled and fat cats in the world. And Julian behaved rationally and he was really good in handling the stress. Of course, as I said, after you spend 7 years inside with not even an hour outdoors, imagine here in Italy, we have horrific mafia killers and we provide them 1 hour outdoors because it's a matter of being human. He had not this opportunity. He had not an hour per day.
I want to talk specifically about the extradition claim to the United States. As a surprise to some people, they didn't charge him with espionage, they charged him with conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. So this was in relation to him offering to help Chelsea Manning crack a password to get into a government computer. I wanted to ask you what you think about that particular charge, and if at best Julian Assange was somewhat slack in terms of journalistic standards in terms of should when Chelsea Manning have asked, can you help me crack this password, should he have said, no, I'm a publisher and that's not something I can do, that would put me at risk and the organisation at risk?
First of all, it's really important to understand that the charges, the indictment, the US indictment, is not really about hacking, as The Intercept, as Glenn Greenwald and Michael Lee reported. Basically, he tried to help Chelsea Manning to cover his identity. It's not about hacking, but rather trying to protect your identity when you access a system, when you access computers. I can tell you, we do these kind of things all the time as journalists. We try to protect our sources, so we explain them how to use phones in order to not to create metadata. We try to explain our source, how to get out the electronic fingerprint from any documents they share, they share with us. We explain our sources, how they should not create metadata using emails or phones. So we have this kind of interaction with sources because we have the duty, the professional duty, ethical duty to protect them. So as far as I can read in the US indictment, there is nothing in that indictment which we traditional journalists are not doing. We do the same.
So in the UK right now, so probably the dominant response from the left is to oppose extradition to the US, seeing it as a threat to freedom of speech or the right to investigate those in power, but support his extradition to Sweden, because in Sweden he's not facing charges as a journalist, he's facing charges as someone who's committed rape. I wondered what you thought about that particular stance and the issue of Assange's extradition to Sweden.
I really don't understand why the UK authorities advised the Swedish prosecutors not to question Mr. Assange in London, why they did advise the Swedish prosecutors to not to stop their investigation in 2013. I'm telling this because my documents, the FOIA litigation, I have started in the UK and Sweden and Australia, US, provide indisputable evidence about this role of the UK authorities to keep the Swedish investigation open, even if the Swedish prosecutor wanted to close it 6 years ago. They wanted Julian not to be questioned in London, but rather to extradite it to Sweden. Why did they want it? When I try to investigate these facts, these are not opinions, these are not my speculation. My documents provide serious, indisputable evidence about this role of the UK Crown Prosecution Service. When I try to dig into these facts, when I try to acquire evidence, the UK Crown Prosecution Service provided an incredible reply. They said that they had destroyed the documents. This is highly suspicious. Why did they do so?
I suppose there's a number of issues there. So one, in terms of, I think what your documents uncovered was that the CPS seemed somewhat keen for Assange to go to Sweden. The counter to that would be that the reason they couldn't question him in London is because investigation means something slightly different in Sweden. So it's something that's further on in the case. So they'd already decided there was an allegation that Assange should answer for, and they wanted to begin basically prosecution proceedings. I mean, some other issues are that you talk about how his reputation could have been dragged through the mud in Sweden before he's extradited there. I mean, there's probably very little worse for someone's reputation than to be seen as avoiding charges of rape or sexual assault. And I suppose one issue that I think has been on lots of people's mind is why would extradition from Sweden be any more likely than extradition from the UK?
I mean, I'm not saying it's more likely or less likely. I'm saying that, I mean, I have seen how corrupt, how distorted the information on the Julian Assange case and on the Wikileaks case has been in the last 10 years. I mean, if you look at all this, if you realize that in the last 10 years, in the last 9 years after the Swedish allegations, not a single journalist tried to acquire the documents about the case in order to reconstruct it factually, you realize how journalism failed this case. Because, I mean, he was inside the embassy. He was a very high profile case, very controversial. So you would expect journalists around the world, important media, very high profile media outlet, getting the documents and try to see what the facts are. They didn't. It took an Italian journalist to try to acquire these documents. So you realize how the full coverage was really weird, because the first thing was to acquire the documents from Sweden, to try to understand what the case was about, to try to understand how they did that. They did manage this case, because it is highly unusual that you don't use judicial cooperation between states. This is what prosecutors do all the time. This is what Sweden does. This is what Italy does with mafia, with terrorists, with whatever. Why didn't they use it? And this decision was really was a disaster, because basically the Swedish prosecution was kept in his preliminary stage for 7 years. And some of the charges, some of the allegations even expired. Why didn't the prosecutor act in order to avoid that some allegation expired? This is incomprehensible to me, because they could have addressed the allegation before they expired. So I mean, the Swedish case is really we still have many mysteries.
Whether or not Assange should have, on a moral level, gone to Sweden, do you think on a strategic level that Julian Assange has squandered quite a lot of moral authority in some of his behaviour over the last decade, and that puts him in a more vulnerable position now when he does seem to have the power of the US state sort of bearing down on him? So obviously not refusing to go to Sweden lost him a lot of allies, and then later on being seen to be siding with, or WikiLeaks being seen to be siding with Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. I don't know if you think Julian Assange has made mistakes over the last 9 years that will make it harder for there to be a sort of unified defence of him in this moment right here, right now.
Look, Julian Assange has certainly made mistakes. I mean, I'm not saying he's a perfect human being, he's a perfect publisher. He's not. Of course, he's not. I didn't like the some of the US reactionaries associated with Trump visiting him in the embassy. I mean, I absolutely didn't like those images. I didn't like certain tweets by the WikiLeaks Twitter handle. So I mean, he certainly made mistakes. He published some of the documents without serious curation. It's true that in some cases he did, and WikiLeaks did. So I'm not saying that he's a perfect human being, he's a perfect publisher. He's not. He seriously made mistakes, and some of those mistakes were serious, in my opinion. At the same time, I can tell you that there was no way to address the Swedish case, because the European arrest warrant didn't provide you any opportunity to address. I mean, the Swedish prosecutors didn't, and the UK authorities never ever show any serious consideration for his well-grounded fears that he could be extradited to the US.
Okay, thank you, Stefania. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks to you and to Novara Media.
That was Stefania Maurizi, investigative journalist with La Repubblica, speaking to me earlier today from Rome. Lots of food for thought there. I'm sure we'll cover some of it throughout the show. I want to start with the facts of the case regarding extradition to the United States, because there's only one request for extradition that relates to Assange at the moment, and it's from the United States. You're an extradition lawyer. You've written the book on the subject. So what happens now? What is the process here? On what grounds did the United States ask for extradition, and is there any chance it can be stopped?
So the grounds are he's been charged with conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, which I understand is an offence that carries a maximum penalty of 5 years. It is possible for it to be stopped through the court process, and there have been a couple of cases over the past 18 months or so where people who have been requested by the US haven't been extradited there. The grounds that he could argue, and he'll have to put forward this defence. It's unlike in criminal cases where the prosecution have to prove their case. In extradition cases, you as the defendant have to put forward everything to support your case. And the grounds that he would rely on are, he could say that it was politically motivated. I'm sure he will. He could say that it's an abuse of the court's process. He would have strong arguments on human rights grounds, and the most obvious human rights that are engaged are Article 6, his right to a fair trial, Article 3, his right not to be tortured or to suffer inhuman or degrading treatment, and Article 10, of course, is freedom of expression. There could be, and this might be one of his strongest arguments practically, an argument about his physical or mental health. Then there's also a possibility that he could argue that his right to specialty protection would be violated. Specialty is a particular rule that applies across extradition treaties around the world, which prevents someone from being prosecuted for an offence other than that for which they've been extradited before. And he could also, finally, I think another big ground for argument is that he could argue that he's being prosecuted in the wrong place. But to argue that, he'd have to argue that he should be prosecuted here instead, which is a slightly...
For those same alleged crimes?
Exactly. He would have to say that the conduct took place here and it's in the interest of justice for him to be prosecuted here. And
to what extent, there's a number of legal arguments taking place there, and I'm sure his lawyers will be deploying many of them. In what sphere does this take place? So is this purely within the court system, or does the Home Secretary, is there a role for government in deciding whether or not Britain will relinquish Assange and send him over to the United States?
So there's a first hearing in the Magistrates' Court, which will probably take place in around 8 months from now, and I'm sure he will deploy all of those arguments. Then the judge in that court will decide whether to send the case to the Secretary of State, who would then make the order for extradition. It used to be the case... What secretary? Is that the Foreign Secretary? For the Home Department.
For the Home Secretary.
So Sajid Javid. And he would then decide whether to order extradition. And the only grounds on which he could decline to order extradition is if he thought that there might be a violation of his specialty rights, or that he might be subject to the death penalty. It used to be the case that the Home Secretary could make a decision about whether someone's human rights could be violated, but that was changed post the case of Gary McKinnon. So the Home Secretary actually has almost no discretion, and then the case would go to the High Court, who would decide on all of those arguments.
So that, I just want to get clear on that specialty issue. So if I've understood that correctly, if Sajid Javid gets the case and he decides America have asked for Assange to be extradited for breaking into a computer which has a maximum sentence of 5 years, but potentially once he gets there, they could turn it into an espionage charge and end up imprisoning him for decades. That's the grounds he could say there's reason to believe that the United States would infringe on specialty, which means you have to be extradited for a particular charge. Yeah, although what he would be arguing is not it's basically that his specialty rights would be violated because the US has a history of violating specialty protection. Do they?
They've got some history, but it's never stopped any US extradition before, so it would be extremely unlikely for Sajid Javid to say no on that ground.
If he does get extradited, what do you think the impact, what are the implications for journalists, for investigative journalism, for freedom of press?
Well, I think before I get into this, I just wanted to bring up the case of Larry Love, because I think that's actually extremely relevant to help us understand also what's at stake. Because Larry Love was threatened with extradition to the US on hacking charges. And essentially the court ruled that the US couldn't be trusted with keeping Larry alive, which was really damning for the US and for the US jail system, essentially, that the US cannot be trusted with keeping British citizens alive in their jail.
The judge was convinced that there was a high enough risk that if he was extradited to the United States, he'd commit suicide.
Yeah, he would commit suicide. He was suffering from Asperger's syndrome, they weren't trusted with his case. So this is also, I mean, Larry Love's case was also there was a lot of support coming from Parliament at the time as well. There was quite a lot of enthusiasm from civil society in supporting his case. So I think that definitely should give us some hope for Julian as well.
I suppose I just want to link back to, I'll go back to you on terms of the implications for journalism, but just because that relates to, you're sort of saying civil society pressure could really help Assange here avoid extradition to the United States. I feel like you were giving the impression earlier that this is basically going to happen in the courts. I don't know what extent you think civil society public pressure can play here.
I think it can play a role, but that role is very much restricted since the Home Secretary's role in relation to human rights was taken away by Theresa May. And so I think, I don't think actually civil society will be as influential in this case as it has been in other cases. It's so nuanced, this case. There's so many layers to it that I can't see that being fundamental.
But Larry Love, that rule change had already happened, hadn't it? So it was Gary McKinnon who was kept in the UK because the Home Secretary had made the decision that his human rights could be violated if he got sent to the United States, and by the time it was Larry Love, it was up to a judge.
Yeah, and so the decision making, it's very hard to know what influence the press has on judges. I mean, judges would say that they are above it, but obviously judges are human beings as well, and they will be influenced by what they see and what they read.
And I suppose back to civil society. So why should civil society mobilise to defend Julian Assange as it did Larry Love?
And I think that the case is different because I think really we need to divorce Julian Assange from really the implication of his extradition to the US, and for that we really need to look at the indictment and what's actually in the indictment. And essentially the section in the indictment that's particularly interesting is the one about manners and means of conspiracy, and essentially it's the ground on which they qualifies Assange's interaction with Manning as being a conspiracy against the US. And what they're essentially describing is just the regular day-to-day activities that any journalist, that day-to-day interaction that any journalist, any investigative journalist would have with the sources. So what are they, what are they referring to? It's the fact that they were using secure communication. They were using Jabber, which is a service which at the time back in 2010, any investigative journalists would have been using. They were calling out on the use of Dropbox, which is just a secure, secure drop, which is just a secure version of Dropbox. Yeah. And the fact that, Assange was encouraging Manning to hand over the documents, but that's that's the reality of many journalists in interacting with the sources. So if we considered that engaging securely with a source can be qualified as a mean and manner of conspiracy against the state, I mean that's a terrifying standard we are setting for journalists in the future. Yes, it was unauthorized documents, but investigative journalism is about publishing documents that are not meant to be in the public eye. So this is where the implications are huge for journalists, and this is where I think, regardless of what journalists and society at large think about Assange. This is why I think it's so important to step up for this case, because it's not about stepping up for Assange, it's about stepping up for freedom of the press.
What's your take, Rebecca, on the strength of the indictment from a legal perspective? Does it we might think it's sort of worrying from a political perspective, but does it stand up? So this charge that they've made against Assange?
Well, in lots of ways, the fact that he's charged with a relatively low-level offence makes it much easier for the courts in this country to make a decision, because they won't be so worried about Article 3, so his right not to suffer inhuman or degrading treatment, those kind of violations, if it's only for a relatively short period.
Because obviously our courts don't have to decide he's guilty, do they? They just have to decide that there's nothing really to worry about if he goes and faces this charge in the United States.
Exactly, yeah.
What if the Trump administration were to, because we know they've been talking about Julian Assange as a traitor and as sort of like an enemy of the United States, what if they were to change the charge up to espionage? Is there anything that Britain could do to stop them trying him for a much more serious crime?
So if they were to change it beforehand, then that would probably make the extradition a little bit harder, because he would then have stronger arguments, and he would definitely have a stronger argument on political motivation. If they were to change it afterwards, so after he's extradited, he would have specialty protection, but that specialty protection, people often don't remember that it's heavily caveated in that the US judge could just go back to the UK court and say, oh, do we have permission to add another charge? And actually it would be the Home Secretary in this case, and if he's decided to extradite him, of course we would probably decide to. So
if they ramp up the charges, that doesn't even go really through our court system, that just goes straight to the Home Secretary, who obviously, well, we know at this point the attitude of the government towards the United States, and it tends to be somewhat subservient. That's not much to rely on, is it, for someone's future?
And that's a big concern that we have. Ben Weisner from the ACLU, who's a lawyer, was writing about like the risk actually of seeing new charges added once Assange would have been extradited. There's also the possibility that we shouldn't forget that at the moment Chelsea Manning is being detained in the US, and there is a risk that basically essentially the reason she is being detained is that they are trying to obtain evidence from her to pursue espionage charges. That's a possibility, that this is what they're really after. This is, I think, a real concern, because essentially, if you look at the charges of hacking, I mean, this is well, I'm not sure if funny is the right word, but this is the funny thing, is that the hacking didn't actually happen. There was a discussion about like, oh, could you help me possibly crack a password? Sure, maybe I'll help. And then that was it. Like there was never actually any concrete action that took place after that. It's not really quite substantial, right? For as an accusation, as a ground for a grand jury and extradition, that seems a bit weak, really. And this is why we have such concern. Basically.
I just want to sort of a quick update on Chelsea Manning, actually. So Chelsea Manning was tried for obviously a different crime to Julian Assange. She was the whistleblower. His claim is he was a publisher. He wasn't a whistleblower. He didn't leak anything. She did leak secrets which were, what's the word? Classified. Which she didn't have the right to leak. Obama gave her a pardon.
It wasn't a pardon, actually.
Okay. So that's what my question is. If he gave her a pardon, how come she's now languishing in jail again?
So it wasn't exactly a pardon. She was just like released earlier. Pardon would have meant that like she would have been considered like innocent of the crime she had committed. So it wasn't exactly a pardon. She was just it was the case of an early release. The reason she's back in jail at the moment is that she was asked to testify as part of the grand jury. She was asked to testify against Assange, and she refused to do so. And so this is why she's being detained at the moment. It's for refusing.
So it's directly related to this case.
Yes, absolutely.
And will she stay in jail until she agrees? I mean,
unclear to me.
You don't know that either. It's complex. Let's go to the Sweden issue for a moment. I can totally see why we need to, in the case of the US extradition, keep our eyes what he's actually being extradited for, and not make this about the individual, but make it about the principle of someone being extradited for undertaking normal activities required in investigative journalism. But in Britain, I think there's a very understandable debate going on, and it will become practically significant if Sweden do at some point decide to reopen their case for their case against Assange and request his extradition. So I mean, you've heard Stefania's sort of ideas on this. I wondered what you thought about the case against him coming from Sweden, and whether that extradition should be supported.
Well, so it was a serious offence that he was accused of in Sweden, and the only reason that he couldn't be prosecuted for it was because he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. He argued that the reason that he didn't want to go to Sweden was because it was a disguised request from the US, and that as soon as he went to Sweden, the request would be made from the US, and it would somehow be easier for him to go to the US. That doesn't make sense to me legally. It's easy to get someone from the UK to the US. It's probably pretty easy to get someone from Sweden to the US as well. But it's actually harder if they go from the UK to Sweden and then a request is made, because you have to ask for consent from both countries. So I think if he had gone to Sweden, he'd be in a safer position now than that he's currently in.
And I just want to run through some of the arguments, because obviously there's been a lot written about this case and a lot of controversy about it. So one of the things Stefania was talking about was the idea that data or evidence or correspondence she has uncovered through Freedom of Information requests show that the CPS, the British Crown Prosecution Service, seemed particularly reluctant to let him be interviewed in the Ecuadorian embassy, and were quite keen on his extradition, and have since, as she said, deleted a bunch of these emails. I wondered if that seemed to you odd in any way, or if that's to be expected.
It seems odd that they deleted the emails. It is, however, not surprising that they didn't want him to be interviewed here. It would be, his extradition had been agreed on by the High Court. He exercised his rights to resist extradition all the way to Supreme Court, which is not many people get to do in extradition cases. And so I could see why the CPS here were quite motivated to just get him gone.
And then I suppose the final one on this issue is so the sort of compromise position from Assange supporters has been that he would, and it's the official position actually from his lawyer as well and from himself, which is that he would allow for and voluntarily sort of be extradited or go to Sweden to face the charges if they could give him assurances that he wouldn't be then onward extradited to the United States. Is that a reasonable position? Could he have asked for those assurances?
Well, he did ask, and he would never get them, because how could Sweden commit itself to not agreeing to any extradition requests from the US? It couldn't do that. It's reasonable to ask, as the Ecuadorians did, for there to be assurances as to the death penalty, for example, and that he won't be subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment anywhere that he's extradited to. But they couldn't bind Sweden to anything.
So it's a bit of a red herring potentially.
A total red herring, yeah.
Ever any thoughts on this, or we can move on to WikiLeaks?
No, and I mean, I think it's important though to remember though that the case that hasn't been reopened, and there is no sign at the moment of any reopening of the case. So this is also what we need to bear in mind, is that for all the discussions around Sweden though, that this is not what's at stake at this stage. Whatever we may think of what should have happened.
And if I can just come in there, so I think one of the things that is particularly odd is that it appears that there was coordination between the UK authorities and the US authorities in relation to this recent arrest, but there was no communication apparently with the Swedish authorities, and I find that surprising. I don't know why that was.
And I mean, the context of the arrest, I think it was partly covered with Stefania, but it's worth reiterating because there's been a sort of odd or somewhat ridiculous campaign in the UK press to sort of make it seem like he was kicked out because he was ungrateful, or because he was difficult, or because he was skateboarding, or because he was smearing poop on the walls. And we need to be clear that the reason his asylum was retracted and he was ejected from the Ecuadorian embassy is because their politics has shifted to the right. So he was granted asylum by Rafael Correa, who had a somewhat antagonistic relationship to the United States and appreciated what WikiLeaks had done to sort of reveal the United States activities across the world. He's been replaced by Lenin Moreno, who has sort of undertaken a dramatic shift to the right. Most people from the Correa administration seem to consider him a traitor, even though he's from their own party. So Correa's come out heavily against the ejection of Assange.
No, and over the past, from what I heard from people who were close to Assange and much closer to the context in the embassy, is like essentially for the past year, it was very clear that this was going to happen at any moment. So it was more like, if anything, it was more surprising to them that it took so long, but they knew this was going to happen. Absolutely.
I remember Glenn Greenwald actually published an article, I think almost a year ago, saying that they were about to eject them, and then sort of for about 6 months there were all these centrists saying like, oh, Glenn Greenwald's published fake news. And it's like, it was true. It was just, it took him a while to do it. And so is that odd that the UK and Ecuador and the US had been involved together? Is that unexpected from a legal perspective?
Yeah, well, the whole reason that he was in the Ecuadorian embassy was because of a Swedish EAW, European arrest warrant. So I would expect there to have been some communication.
Let's go on to WikiLeaks, the legacy of WikiLeaks and its broader impact on investigative journalism. I'll direct this to you first. So I think when WikiLeaks was publishing in 2010, that was sort of an idea that this model of journalism was going to transform politics and transform our understanding of politics. One, because it was, in a sense, peer-to-peer, so it wasn't sort of top-down and mediated by establishment media organisations, and two, the internet just made loads more information available. So it's kind of a techno-optimism that the internet would mean that governance would become more transparent and governments would be held to account. I wonder what you think about where we are 9 years later. So has that come to fruition? Do we see a system where governments are held to account more often because more information is available, or have we seen a backtrack?
No, I think there's been huge changes in the way we approach journalism, in the way journalists approach their relationship with their audience. I think that was really the dramatic shift with WikiLeaks, is that this idea that suddenly actually maybe the public deserve to have access to the source material. The public deserve to be able to make their own judgments based on the evidence that they've collected. And so I think there was it created sort of a new appetite for both data journalism and investigative journalism at the time that I think still lives on today. In actually, even you mentioned Glenn Greenwald in the way the work that The Intercept is doing, for example, but in also in many ways in which we're trying to think about media differently, about the importance of investigative journalism, and how this really should structure our approach to society. I think there was some dramatic shift at the time back in 2010 that were that WikiLeaks contributed, I think, to some large movement. I would never say that like WikiLeaks triggered the Arab Spring. That would be a ludicrous statement to make. But certainly, like what I remember from the early days of WikiLeaks were people in Tunisia marching in the streets, holding diplomatic cables from the US. Those were images that we had never seen before. This idea that like journalism could really empower a social movement. So that I think, to that extent, I really think that a lot of the journalism we see today, which is independent, investigative journalism, very much evidence-based, is, a heritage that we've got from WikiLeaks.
And the Arab Spring example was specifically because the diplomatic cables had revealed information about luxurious lifestyles of the Tunisian
of the Tunisian
president
government, president.
To what extent do you think So say Assange does get extradited to the United States and he's tried and found guilty for this particular crime. I mean, I think The Intercept sort of called this the death of journalism, potentially. So I suppose the question here is, to what extent could this sort of pursuit of Julian Assange spill over to other media outlets and to other investigative journalists? Or do you see this as a somewhat isolated case?
I think that is more a question for Eva.
Okay, go on.
No, I think that's precisely the real risk. Because if you look again, like if you look at the indictment, as I said, like the hacking the hacking charge doesn't really hold because the hacking didn't actually happen. So what they're really going after is what their interpretation of what is perceived as a conspiracy. And if to conspire against the state is to securely communicate with your source and to encourage your source to release material, then we're in big trouble, because this is essentially what journalism is about. And I think the thing is, when the New York Times or the Guardian publish massive piece of investigative journalism, we don't think about the backstory, the in and outs of like how they actually access the material they're releasing. We just trust them that they're journalists and they're doing their jobs. And yet Wikileaks, like the US, is now starting to instill this doubt that, well, actually there was something wrong with the way this material has been obtained. But the something wrong is the work that any journalist would be doing. So I think that's a real risk. The other thing I'd like to mention is that it's now very clear that the case had been dropped under the Obama administration. Like the WikiLeaks grand jury was started back in 2010. So this is when they started investigating this case. Now, the reason we haven't heard about it from all those years is because actually, we have reasons to believe now that the Obama administration thought it was way too sensitive in terms of press freedom. And again, we also have reasons to believe from documents that have emerged from the court, the affidavit, which shows that there is some FBI employees who've been appointed to lead on the case following Trump's election. That under the Trump administration, the idea that journalists could be prosecuted is no longer a red line, basically.
And so that there was a perfect storm, really, wasn't there? A rightward shift in Ecuador, a rightward shift in the United States.
Yeah.
Obama had decided that, because another thing that's I think important is that this communication with Chelsea Manning about the password, that's been known for years. Yeah. But Obama decided that even with that information, that should not be the grounds for a prosecution, because that would endanger investigative journalism and press freedom. Donald Trump comes in, he says, we're going to be tough on whistleblowers. I mean, potentially this is a little bit of Kremlinology, but potentially he wants to show he's tough on Julian Assange to show that he's not in hock to him, or that he's not in hock to Russia. So you can imagine a sort of a particularly political motivation coming from there. Do you think the mainstream press have let WikiLeaks or Julian Assange down? I mean, so one thing I found notable, even with all the the complications and that comes with Julian Assange, when he was kicked out of the embassy, there was a bit of a sort of scoffing attitude, I thought, from people, and some people from the Guardian or the New York Times, people whom he had provided the basis, the information for the biggest scoop of the decade for them, and then he's coming out and they're joking about his beard. And I wonder if you feel like the implications of this extradition request and the case of Julian Assange over the last decade have been taken sufficiently seriously by the established press.
Well, I think now is really the key moment. This is when we are expecting to see journalists stepping up. This is the time when they need to step up. And to be fair, we have seen quite a few journalists from The Guardian and the New York Times being very clear on their position to the extradition. And this is where whether there will be an impact from civil society on the consequence of this extradition extradition, but I think journalists need to be very clear on this issue. That if it's not in this, like, you know, it's not about liking Julian Assange. It's not about, you can make fun of him all you want, but what's at stake will have consequences for all of them, and it's particularly relevant for journalists who were publishing and who were partnering with WikiLeaks at the time. I think that it's particularly important to see those journalists stepping up, and we've seen some of the from some of opposition to the extradition, but I think we need much sort of clearer support. And to be fair, I understand up until now the reluctance to show any support to someone who's seen as evading rape charges. Like I understand that. I understand distancing yourself from Assange on that case. But now that and this is what also is becoming very clear from his arrest. Now that Sweden is completely out of the equation, that it is purely a question of U.S. extradition. For conspiracy, essentially, then we need to really step up and address this issue as such.
Okay, I'm going to take some audience questions in a moment, so get typing those. In the meantime, you're watching Tiski Sour. Novara Media is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already a subscriber to Novara, thank you. What makes this possible? If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears higher up in people's news feeds. Please share it. Please share it on Twitter, because we want more people to watch. And if you have particular ideas for shows, feel free to tweet me at MichaelJS Walker on Twitter. Question time. Right. Let's see if you get any in there. None quite yet. Right. What do you think about the claims that WikiLeaks ended up being irresponsible fundamentally? And I suppose this is a broader question about journalistic ethics in terms of the ideology of radical transparency, which is that you just get the data out there and that's a good thing. There were criticisms that put people's life in danger, for example, if you end up releasing sensitive information about, I think there were cases of people's sexuality or people's vulnerability, etc., etc. Did you think that WikiLeaks was too trigger happy by pressing the publish button?
I think we need to go back to the actual context of the release at the time. So originally, when the documents started being released, they partnered up with a media organization. This is how the New York Times, the Guardian, eventually actually even like the Telegraph got involved. Le Monde, many different media organizations across the world became partners with WikiLeaks in the release, and the idea that like each newspaper would release material that was relevant in their countries. And so it was the responsibility of journalists to edit documents as they see fit. Now, what happened eventually is Guardian journalists published a book about the partnership with Assange and released the password to the trove of documents in his book. So the understanding was that now the documents would be accessible to anyone who was, just a little bit tech savvy, and they decided to just release en masse all the documents at the time. Whether that was the right decision or not, can be debated. It wasn't the original intent at the start of the publication of the cable. Obviously, personally, I'm much more comfortable with the way it was originally intended to be published, which was journalists sort of like reviewing those documents. What I will say though is that considering the attitude of the US administration at the time, I'm pretty sure that like if there had been substantial damage emerging from the cables, the release of this cable, we would have heard about it.
There's enough people looking for negative consequences of the release that it may well have been found.
Yeah.
Because there's many people who want to show WikiLeaks to be having behaved irresponsibly. Okay, this is from Tweevy. Thoughts on the UN demand for the UK to release Assange a few years ago?
So that was the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I mean, my thoughts are that the detention was not arbitrary.
Can you explain the case first?
Okay,
so the UN.
So it's a particular working group of the UN. I think there's a tribunal of 3 who looked at the papers and looked at the case and said that he should be. I can't remember exactly what they said, but they found that he was being arbitrarily detained in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is a difficult argument legally because, in my view, he wasn't being detained in the Ecuadorian embassy. He was in the Ecuadorian embassy voluntarily, and secondly, it wasn't arbitrary. He was there pursuant to a European arrest warrant issued by Sweden.
Clear answer. Unless you have anything to add on this.
No, other than actually, more recently, there's also been strong support from the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, who's also expressed his support and his concerns. So I think, I actually think it's been quite positive, the support that he's got from the United Nations on his various issues.
This is a very good question. Joseph O. Would a different Home Secretary, for example, Diane Abbott, change much with cases like Assange? I'm going to go to you first, yeah.
I don't think that she would be able to change much in relation to the decision to be made now in relation to the US request. She would have a big role, however, if he were to go to Sweden and onward extradition were to be requested by the US. She would be able to have good grounds to block the extradition in that case.
And presumably also, from what you said earlier, if she was Home Secretary, Assange gets sent over for this particular case that has a 5-year prison sentence, and then the United States ramp up the decision to be about something harder. Then can she block it? Yeah,
she would also have a role there.
So that could be significant if you end up
really
with a government, a Labour government at that point. If America succeeds in this is from Matthew Shearing, if America succeeds in its extradition and adds additional charges, will they go after all of the journalists who corresponded with Edward Snowden? What are the next steps we can expect to see?
Well, that's typically the concerns that I think people should have and journalists should have is precisely journalism that has challenged the US administration. Especially anything related to national security, to documenting the US government apparatus, be it mass surveillance or in the case of Cablegate, the idea was to show the extent to which for a US foreign intervention was really shaping diplomatic relationship all over the world, and so we are now seeing the consequences of that kind of journalism. So I think, there is a risk for anyone like the journalists who've been working with Snowden on this.
And there's a question, are there any other historical precedents for cases like this? So I suppose charges against journalists who have published the content provided by whistleblowers or high-profile extradition cases. And so I don't know if you think there's any historical examples that could be instructive to the audience when it comes to the Assange case.
Well, the most obvious ones are the US ones, as Eva mentioned, Larry Love and Gary McKinnon, although the law has changed since his extradition was refused. Those are the first that spring to mind.
And there isn't that much so the law's changed from one of them, so the Home Secretary can't block it as they did for Gary McKinnon, and with Larry Love, it would depend on whether Assange can give a strong enough case that his life would be at risk if he got put into American prison system or the American judicial system.
And the other thing that he was famously successful on was the forum bar, so the fact that he could argue that all of the conduct took place here, and so it was in the interest of justice for him to be tried here rather than in the United States.
There's one about the organisation of WikiLeaks. That's an interesting question because, it seems less of an organisation than a sort of a man with some people sort of around him at various times. So, the direct question, James Harris, do you think there is likely that there will be future significant WikiLeaks? So is the organisation WikiLeaks still functional, basically? What has it become?
Well, I think I think we know of the recent the recent publication of WikiLeaks that I personally don't want to go into too much detail on that. But I think I think in the sense of the future of whistleblowing platforms. I think we are already starting to see how this is shaping, with a lot of media organization turning to platforms like Secure Drops, like GlobalX, to set up secure way of communicating with sources. We see journalists becoming much more aware, much more savvy, engaging in secure communication with journalists. So that, I think, really is in a sense the future of engaging secure and using technology to securely engage with sources. Yeah.
Final question is a morbid one. How likely is it that Assange would get the death penalty if extradited to America?
So the maximum sentence for the offence that he's been charged with now is obviously 5 years. So if they stick with that, very unlikely. But there have been extremely worrying developments in the UK recently in relation to the death penalty, which historically this country has been dead set against and campaigning around the world to stop it. In this year, in fact, there has been a case in relation to an ISIS fighter where the Home Secretary handed over evidence to the US without seeking an assurance that he would not be subject to the death penalty. And there was also a piece of legislation which more or less passed under the radar, the Crime Overseas Production Order Act, where the US will be able to request information from the UK without getting a death penalty assurance from the US.
Solid answer. Let's end it there. That was very interesting. You put both of your areas of expertise to the issue, and it's definitely clarified a lot for me. Also, thank you to Stefania Maurizi for speaking to us from Rome. We'll be back next week at 8 p.m. Normal time. So thank you both so much for joining me today. And thank you for watching. See you next week.